this is Ed Kramer, who is Mr. Pioneer.
Hi, guys. Welcome to this really special session. We are very, very honored and privileged to have with us an amazing human being who was seminal in so many things early in the history of computer graphics. Scott Ross was at Industrial Light and Magic during The Abyss and Terminator 2, and at the beginnings of Jurassic Park. And then, of course, he went off and started a little company called Digital Domain. Let's hear it for Digital Domain.
How much do I have to pay you for saying those nice things?
We'll negotiate. This is Scott's book, Upstart. Unfortunately, as I mentioned at the Pioneers event with Ed Catmull, we don't have a bookstore this year at SIGGRAPH. Tariffs and weirdness, so I won't go into any further. But Scott will be having a meet and greet, and we do have a little something that he can sign for you if you wanna get his signature on something. And I do have the QR code here, so if anybody wants to buy his book while you're sitting here, you can do that. I'm going to just ask him some questions and get him to kind of, all I need to do is just say, Scott, talk for an hour, and he can do that. But I'll try to ask a few questions in there. And then, of course, we will open it up to questions from you guys, and we're going to try to get all that jammed into an hour. So, you know, I guess my first question would be, Scott, you're here with the SIGGRAPH audience. So, you know, what kind of history do you have with SIGGRAPH? And, you know, did you send people to SIGGRAPH from Digital Domain and ILM?
There was always arguments as to who would go, right? Because, as you're probably well aware, there was very little profit margin, if any, in visual effects. And so the opportunity for us to just say, okay, guys, you know, Doug Kay, you and George drop up your entire department and go to SIGGRAPH. It just wasn't going to happen. You know, we didn't really have the cash to be able to do that. My experiences at SIGGRAPH, interestingly enough, was, and we could talk about that with the rock and roll sensibility, was, you know, I'm not a technical person. I'm not really a management person. I'm sort of a jack of many trades and a master of absolutely nothing. And I decided we were going to have parties at SIGGRAPH. I thought SIGGRAPH parties were really important. And so I came up with this idea while I was at Digital Domain that we didn't have the money to have a party. So I went to all of our vendors and I told them, you know, we're going to have this party, and if you sponsor it, we'll give you X number of tickets depending upon how much money you're willing to put in. And because of my sort of musical connections and my musical sensibilities, we were able to get acts that were just unbelievable. You know, like the Stray Cats and the Five Blind Boys of Alabama, and, you know, I mean, just on and on and on. Great Billy Idol. And our parties became sort of legendary. And so SIGGRAPH to me meant a lot of tequila, a lot of dancing, and meeting old friends. And there was one, I used to go to electronic theater, and I remember one time seeing Paul Debevic's work while he was still at Berkeley, I think. And I thought, I gotta hire this guy. And I tried for about 11 years and it was never successful.
You know, he's still around. So in the book, let's start talking a little bit about the book. One of the themes that kind of follows through the book is something that your mother said to you early on. So share with the group what.
Well, I grew up as a Jewish kid in a Jewish, Italian, Irish neighborhood in Queens, New York, and my parents were you know, Depression-era people. And all they cared about was, could you get a job, right? They didn't really have, hi Sebastian, they really didn't have high expectations. They wanted me to go to college, and they wanted me to get a job, but my mother would always pull me aside and she would say, so what do you want to do? Do you want to help humanity, or do you want to make a lot of money? And being a technograph that I was, I knew what the right answer was, which was, I want to help the world. And then under my breath, I'd say, and I want to make a lot of money.
That's great. All right, so and you wrote this book, you did it as a collaboration with Joanne Levin.
Right.
What is it like writing a book, and what was the collaboration between the two of you like?
So, I would be really a great jazz musician if I didn't have sort of ADHD. So I have a problem really focusing on things for really long periods of time. And the concept of writing a book that covered, 35 or 40 years was just daunting and overwhelming. So I felt I needed a collaborator. And I knew this guy in Arizona, his name was Bobby Levin, and we were talking, and he said, oh, my wife does that. I said, really? So stupidly, once again, I didn't get any writing samples. I had a brief conversation with her, and I liked her. And we worked out a way in which we were going to work, and the way in which we were going to work is that 3 times a week, we would have 2-hour sessions. And she would write, and then she'd send it back to me, and then I would edit. And then we would discuss how the book was supposed to flow. I didn't want it to flow sort of by timeline, and it sort of does, but I wanted to jump around. She did an amazing job, and I can't speak more highly of her than I am now. She's amazing. Yeah.
That's great. So, in the book, you talk about the kind of culture that you wanted to create, and how that culture was kind of based on your past in rock and roll and with musicians. So, what do you mean by a rock and roll culture?
Well, I guess it doesn't really have that much to do with actual rock and roll. It's just a rock and roll sensibility, which is, play hard, work hard, play hard, work hard, and collaborate and listen to the other players, and the other players will allow you to be a better player than you are, and to enjoy life and enjoy what you're doing. And I got to tell you, when I started Digital Domain, it was very, very difficult. I mean, here we were, a brand new company. It was me and Cameron and Stan Winston, and Cameron and Stan Winston were basically, absentee landlords. And so I wound up hiring people and creating a culture that was, rock and rollish. We were wild and crazy folks. We started. I'll give you an example. A good friend of mine, one of my mentors, died of AIDS. He was the fellow in charge of OnePass, a video post-production company that I worked at in San Francisco. And so we would go to the AIDS walk in Los Angeles. Digital Domain would sponsor it. And we made condoms up that said, come with us if you want to live. And it was that sensibility. We had t-shirts that said, Upstart, we're still here. The entire marketing sensibilities of the company is, we were young, we were sort of pirates, we flew a pirate flag, and there's nothing like having sort of a common, I'll use the word enemy, but it's not really an enemy, but somebody to shoot at. And because of my experience at Industrial Light and Magic, and how I was forced out of the company, which is in the book, my target was to win Academy Awards and show Industrial Light and Magic, at least Lucasfilm, because the people at ILM, we got along very, very well. I loved all of the people there, and the work was fantastic, and I learned a lot. But the actual senior management of the company and I didn't see eye to eye, and I wanted to prove to my friends at ILM that I could do it. And so it was that, within that sensibility and that culture, that we always had a target. We knew where we were going. We were taking risks. It was really pioneer stuff. And we shot very, very high. And we partied like it was 1999. We had great times.
Tell us a little about your musical background and the early years. I mean, you got to play with Miles Davis.
Well, I didn't actually get to play with Miles Davis. I was always a technical person. So I was a sound engineer and I was a mixer, and I went out on the road with a bunch of bands who, at the time, I didn't really realize that they would become iconic bands. I was sort of in the right place at the right time. I I grew up in New York City. I wound up being, a tech for their sound system at the Fillmore East. And I went on tour with the Miles Davis Band, and I went on tour with the Allman Brothers Band. And all of these great sort of iconic things, artists of the time, but at the time I didn't realize that they were iconic. For example, when we went out on tour with Miles would get on stage in the band of anybody who's a jazz head. It was Keith Jarrett, Jack DeJohnette, Airto, Flora Purim. They were the creme de la creme in the jazz world at the time. And they'd get on stage and they'd play one song for like an hour. And to me it sounded like cacophony. I had no idea what we were doing, and I was trying to mix it. And then I'd get back in the bus, and all they would talk about would be Jimi Hendrix. That was it. They were really into Jimi Hendrix. But when they played jazz, it was like, what the hell is that? Now, having studied saxophone and being somewhat of a mediocre jazz player, I look back and I listen to it and it makes perfect sense. It's just beautiful, wonderful. Bitches Brew was the album that was out at the time that I was on tour with them, and wow.
So you were a manager, and you were a manager at Industrial Light and Magic, my former company. In fact, I was hired by Doug Kay sitting here many years ago. And in the book, you talk a lot about what it takes to actually manage and run a company in this unpredictable environment. And you talk about the 3 legs to the stool.
Yeah, Ed's heard about that. So, but first, let me say that when I got to Industrial Light and Magic, first of all, I interviewed something like 40 times. The receptionist interviewed me. I was hired as director of operations. I didn't know what that meant, nor did my boss, Warren Franklin, at the time, who was the general manager. When I got there, I was told all of these departments reported to me, but in fact, they really didn't. They were working for Dennis Murin and Ian Bryce, the head of production. And so I was just confused. I didn't know what was going on. And maybe Doug can sort of help me out here. I walked into an environment where, you're the creme de la creme visual effects house in the world. You have 80% market share. You're knocking the ball out of the park. You're winning Oscars left and right, but you're losing money. Not only are you losing money, but the people that are working there are working like 80 hours a week during crunch time. So the attitude of the employee base when I first got there was, where's George? Because he never showed up. And I'm working too hard. In fact, one of the guys in the optical department, may he rest in peace, had a heart attack. And so that issue of, I thought this was going to be like going to heaven, and I wound up, it was sort of like hell. And I had to rearrange the way the company worked, the way people reported, who reported to whom. And then when I got there was a mandate from George, Lucas that is, there was a mandate from George not to spend any money on any equipment. So here I was at ILM, and they couldn't buy equipment. In fact, we had really no personal computers. In fact, the only computers that were really around was the Pixar Cube, which was in Doug's department. And so we needed to buy personal computers. And I was told by the ranch and the powers that be, the president of the company, Doug Norby, that I wasn't allowed to spend any money. And this is where rock and roll comes back in. I basically said, screw you, I'm just gonna do it. And I wound up buying a whole bunch of Macintoshes, which made my friend who sold us the Macintoshes very happy. And then all of a sudden we started spending money again. And the attitude of the employee base started to change. And they realized that things were getting reinvigorated and things were happening. And Doug, your department was how many people when I first got there?
When you got there, probably 12.
12. Pretty soon it was like 30, 35. Yeah. So things just started to migrate towards digital. Obviously there was Dennis Murin and John Nolan, those people, Scott Squires and the like that were supporting that. But from a management point of view and a financial point of view, I was the spearhead. And my attitude was just, Doug's not going to tell me what to do. George never shows up. Screw you. I'm just going to buy shit. And we did. And it changed. Oh, the three legs of the stool, I'm sorry.
That's all right, I was going to repeat the question.
Three legs of the stool. I think that culture is really important and critical to a company, and the head of the company needs to set the culture. And if the group doesn't get the culture, then you're never going to go anywhere. Additionally, I do think that the management or the person who's in charge of the company has to be cut from the same cloth as the employee base. So if you come in and you're a Stanford MBA and you've never worked in a production company and you sort of like movies, you've seen 3 or 4 of them, it's not going to work. The people that work for you will not get you and they won't trust you. Hence the term suits. And I was dead set against ever being a suit. And when I went to work, I would bring my saxophone in and I would play. And so the culture of the company was really, really critical, especially when we started Digital Domain, because we could set the culture ourselves. The other thing was creativity. You needed to be able to allow creative people to make mistakes and do the best that they can under the constraints of a financial oversight. So I remember a time there was a group pulled together, I guess it was on Titanic. Sebastian, you might be able to help me out here. And when they read the script, they came back and they said, it's going to cost $28 million, we need X number of CPUs more, this is what we need, we can't do it, this is the only way. And I pulled back from that Apollo 13 scene where that box was set up and they threw all the crap in it, and Ed Harris gets to say, figure it out. And needless to say, they did, and the company won an Academy Award for it. So that's another part. And then finally, and I think it's something that's overlooked a lot, particularly from the artist community, is the financial aspect of the company. Because cash is the bloodline of a company. If you don't have cash, you're not in business. And if you're not profitable, you can't really build your employee base and give them the education they need and the benefits they need and all of that. So if any one of those legs of that stool are not there, the stool falls over. So you have to have all 3. And that's critical.
Okay, let's get into the issues in the visual effects world, because what you're going to hear now is going to resonate with a lot of you, I think, because we've all been, and everybody who's worked in production knows that there are issues with how the business model is currently set up. So describe what you refer to as the business model from hell, and then the mystery dance that has to be done in order to work within this model.
So the business model from hell was basically the way it was since visual effects really started. And that was, you bid on the project, you competitively bid against other companies. In the beginning, there weren't even really storyboards. It was just a script. And we had our own in-house art department in ILM, and they would storyboard out the sequences. Then you'd sit down with the visual effects supervisor and the visual effects producer, and then we'd pull together the heads of all of the department, and we'd go through the script and do a breakdown and say, we think we should do it this way. This should be a creature. This should be, a model. This should be, etc. And then visual effects production would put together a budget, and then we turn the budget in. And it made no difference what the price was. It was always too expensive. Now, was it too expensive? Probably not. But, and I can say this because I'm Jewish, it comes from the culture of the schmata business. The movie industry was started by a bunch of Jewish guys, and the whole concept was handling. Wait, that's too much money. What are you talking about? I can't afford that. That's too much money. And the people at the studios at the time didn't have a clue how visual effects were made or what it cost. So if you said it was $100, they wanted it for $50. And if you said, okay, I'll do it for $50, they said, oh no, Rhythm and Use will do it for $20. And so it continued to get just, as we call it, the race to the bottom. But you were under a fixed contract. And since you were under a fixed contract, you had to do what the studio asked you to do. Plus, there were no streamers. So back then there were 6 clients. And the 6 clients got together once a month, and they would sit around and have a lunch. And what would they talk about? Now, what was becoming the largest portion of a motion picture bid, which was visual effects. And they talk about, well, I hear ILM's doing this, and I hear Digital Domain's doing that. And you couldn't really afford to piss off any of those 6 people.
Those 6 people, by the way, were the heads of the studios, of the 6 major studios.
They were the heads of post-production, generally speaking, or the head of the studio. And they would sit around and they would sort of diss on each one of the visual effects companies. And there's that famous line from a producer who has recently, unfortunately, passed away. You might know who he is, I won't say, who said, "I'm not doing my job unless I put a visual effects company out of business." So their whole conceit was bringing the price down till you bled. And so as a result, we were creating things that were never created before. Nobody came to you and said, you know, in that Star Trek movie in number 2, we like the same effects in Star Trek 5. No, they wanted things different. And when they wanted things different, we didn't really know how to do it. And we had an idea, and we didn't really know how much it was going to cost. And then you were stuck with that bid. And then things started to happen where all of a sudden a director might say, you know, that seagull looks like a Pacific seagull in that shot. It needs to be a North Atlantic seagull because that's where the ship went. And so you have to go back in and redo it. And since you had none of the control of what was being asked for, you had all of the financial responsibility, and you were under a timeline to be able to deliver it, so because the movie needed to come out on July 4th, it was the business model from hell. The scary part about it, and I'll get into what your next question is because I know what it's going to be, why didn't we do anything about it? So for years, I've been trying to pull things together like that. Back when I was in Industrial Light and Magic, I started a group called the Association of Visual Effects Creators, AVEC. I did that because I took French in junior high school. And we thought, great, let's get all of the major companies, of which there were only 5, together to discuss it. But the competition was so unbelievably tense that no one trusted one another. So they couldn't come together to form a trade association that would have the ability to go back to the studios and say, we're mad as hell, we're not going to take it anymore. And so what happened? It disbanded. Years later, when I was running Digital Domain, I tried the same thing. And by the way, I've been blackballed by VES because I thought VES would be the greatest platform to be able to be that trade association. But the VES said, no, we just throw parties and give out awards. So I failed every single time. And I think a lot of it just had to do with fear, because there was a sense of scarcity, that maybe there wasn't enough work. And so they didn't want to piss off those 6 clients, because if you pissed off any one of those 6 clients, you wind up being blackballed. But with a trade association, you could pay the trade association overhead, etc., and the people that were running the trade association could go in there in a Swiss way, not representing Digital Domain, Ribbon and Hughes, ILM, Boss Films, Apogee, whatever. They could go in representing the industry and saying, we're not working like this anymore. We're going to be on a cost plus markup basis, like commercial production. Here's our markup. There's going to be total transparency. You can see what we're doing, and that's how we're going to work. But fear got in the way, and as a result, you're still getting screwed.
I mean, I saw that fear firsthand when I was working on a movie called Stargate, and we kept getting change after change after change, but there was no way to bill for those changes, and it was just up to us to just keep working on the movie and do what the director wanted, and and the tendency as artists who are working at a company is to blame your management. Why didn't they do a better job of reining in the director? But it's really, and you talk about this, it's a bigger problem than that.
Well, it gets even deeper because most of the men and women in the trenches that are actually doing the work, their heroes are the directors. And so they want to be like the directors. So they can't basically say, you know what, Michael Bay is making me work, 14 hours a day. I'm not going to do it. So who do they have to blame? They blame management. Because management is the only object that they can see that they think can control it. By the way, it was a funny line. He sent me that picture and I said, can you do something about the wrinkles? And he said, well, I could, but it's going to cost more and it'll put me out of business. So.
Great, so, and we're going to return to this topic, I'm sure, but let's talk a little bit about what it was like trying to start a major company from scratch, and how did you get the idea to put the digital domain together, and then what was the process like, and just riff on that.
So, the old adage is necessity is the mother of invention, and as I was forced out of Industrial Light and Magic by Doug Norby, I was 42 years old, I had 3 kids, a wife that worked in the home, and I was the general manager of Industrial Light and Magic. And I'm thinking to myself, once I'm gone, the phone's going to ring. I mean, every studio is going to call me on the phone, and I'm going to have incredible opportunities. Well, the phone never rang. It rang, actually, I take that back, it rang once. I was offered a job as the CEO of ShowScan. You know what ShowScan is? Yeah. And I thought to myself, I've been playing for the Los Angeles Dodgers, and they want me to play for the, Mississippi Mud Hens. I'm not going to do it. So I was unemployed, and I had expenses. Now, I didn't have, Jim Cameron expenses, but I had expenses. And I had kids in school, and I thought, what the hell am I going to do? And there was a fellow named Scott Billups. I don't know if you know him, but Scott Billups is a really interesting guy. And he was, back in 1992, licensing the likenesses of people like Marlon Brando so he could create digital replicas of them. And he and I had a relationship, and he called me on the phone, and he said, Jim Cameron and I just had a conversation, and he had heard that you left Industrial Light and Magic. Now, when I was at ILM, we did Terminator 2 in the Abyss, and so I had somewhat of a relationship with him. And I think Jim's dream, and I guess it's coming true now, is to be the new George Lucas. He was enamored with George and enamored with Star Wars, and I guess Avatar is his Star Wars franchise. And so we didn't really know each other very well, but we knew each other from a business perspective, and I guess he thought because I was, at this point now, a senior VP at Lucasfilm overseeing like 5 divisions, and that I was out on the street, that we could form a company. So he got to Billups, and Billups got back to me and said, why don't you call Jim? And I did. And he said, let's get together and let's talk about starting a company. And it wasn't that it was something I wanted to do. It was not a burning passion. What I really wanted to do was play with the Miles Davis band, But I kept having nightmares that I was wearing a shiny black suit playing Havana Gila at bar mitzvahs. And so eventually, Jim said, why don't you fly down to Burbank and because I was in Northern California, fly down to Burbank and let's talk about it. I show up at Lightstorm, which was his production company, which used to be at the Burbank airport. And interestingly enough, so I get there, and this other guy shows up, and his name is Stan Winston. Now, of course, I've heard of Stan Winston, because he was a very famous creature creator, but for the life of me, I had no idea why he was at that meeting. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why it was important to have a creature character creator who had his own studio be part of Digital Domain. And what it was, interestingly enough, when Stan did Jurassic Park and ILM did Jurassic Park, the press that was all over Industrial Light and Magic, because it was breakthrough stuff, didn't give Stan the time of day. Right. And so Stan's ego couldn't take it. And Stan decided that he needed to be in the computer graphics animation business. So what does Stan do? He buys a bunch of gigantic SGI, multi-threaded Onyx machines. And it was like, why? And once he figured out, or someone told him, and he hired 10 people, why, he saw a great opportunity to go to his good friend Jim Cameron and say he wanted to be part of Digital Domain. And oh, by the way, you at Digital Domain, when you raise the money, have to buy those servers. Wow. So that's how Stan became part of Digital Domain, and that's how Digital Domain started. And, you know, as I said, Ed was probably employee number 4. We were shooting from the hip. We were setting our sights high. We had an investment of $15 million from the IBM Corporation back in 1993. Jim and Stan and I put no money in whatsoever. We formed what was known as an operating committee, which I thought was a great idea. It was came up with a lawyer friend named Ray Sanchini, because what the concept was we didn't want to be behooving to IBM, because IBM didn't have any of the hardware that we could use. So we put an operating committee together, which was comprised of Jim, Stan, and I, and that the 3 of us would make 98% of the decisions of the company, and that we would meet, supposedly, once a month. We might have met 4 times between 1993 and 1998, because Stan had nothing to say, and Jim was too busy. So there was really no input by Stan and Jim, and now I'm running solo, no partners, and I guess I'm lucky. I hired some really great people, and those great people is what made Digital Domain great. And that's my story, I'm sticking to it.
What was it like winning your first Oscar?
I hate to use the word, but it was like retribution. You know, it was like, it literally was. I mean, when I was in Industrial Light and Magic, and not that I did anything to win those Oscars, but we won an Oscar every year, right? And then when I left, ILM won an Oscar for Forrest Gump. And then they didn't win Oscars for a long while, right? And so it was sort of like, you know, and when we were nominated for True Lies, you know, we lost to Forrest Gump. And then the next Oscar was, you know, What Dreams May Come. And I think I went with Ed to a screening. And I turned to him and said, we're going to win the Oscar in this one, because it was so frickin' beautiful. And so that first Oscar was amazing. The second Oscar was Titanic, and that was even more amazing, because the blood that our people shed to make that movie was just unbelievable. The amount of work, energy, and effort, and ultimately we lost money on that film. And then, we wound up being nominated for, I guess it was in between that, we were nominated for Apollo 13, and we lost to Babe. And that was one of the low lights of my life. And the line was, well, everybody knows that a rocket ship can take off and go into outer space, but nobody knows that a pig can talk. And so I wound up going to Australia, and I had some interesting conversations with the Aussies there about their pig. But Living News did a great job, and I was totally depressed for about a month.
So tell us a little bit more about Titanic and Jim. I mean, how did he impact the bottom line and also the lives of the artists on that movie?
I like to say, I use this line a lot, that Jim Cameron and I had religious differences. He thought he was God and I didn't agree. It was brutal, just brutal, because it was his company and he was our client. And he really looked at it from the point of view of being a producer and a director as opposed to being the chairman of this company. So it was his playground, of which at least George with ILM, it was his playground, but when the shortfall happened, George wrote a check at Digital Domain, when the shortfall happened, Jim just laughed and collected his several dozen $1 million for directing Titanic. So it was really, really difficult, and I had to play the bad guy with Jim, and Jim was king of the world. There was no one that told him he couldn't do this. And I remember a day I walked into Ed Olbert's office. We were at one of the board meetings that he actually showed up at, and the two of us got into it, and we walked into Ed's office. And at the time, I was in really good shape. I was bench pressing like 200 pounds. And Jim's a lot taller than I am, but I thought I could take him. I know I can, because he's skinny. I could take him. He looks like Larry Bird. I can take him. And we were that close in Ed's office, nose to nose, and with my nose I was pretty far away. And I was screaming at him, and he was screaming at me. And so that was the end of any relationship whatsoever. And then he came back to me, and he and Stan, because the operating committee, remember, there were 3 people, 3 votes. 2 of them were always Jim's votes, because you know the difference between a brown noser and an ass kisser? Depth perception. And so Stan Winston's career was all about Jim Cameron. And so every time Jim said, paint it black, Stan was painted black. And I could say paint it white, but I lost 2-1. So we were at a meeting, and Jim said to me that he and Stan had decided that I should no longer be the CEO of the company. And I said, okay. And he said, the operating committee is going to vote on it 2-1, I lose. Okay, so what do you want me to do? He said, I'm going to be the C, Stan's going to be the E, and you're going to be the O. I said, oh shit. So the next thing that happened is he said, you got to go hire a president. So I did an international search for a president, and I never told my board what I was doing. And so the next board meeting, everyone shows up, and I present the candidates that we're going to hire and tell them what we're going to do with the CEO position. And my partners were the IBM Corporation and Cox Enterprises, the cable company, and they just about fell on the floor. They said, that's not going to happen. No, we're not. As a matter of fact, we're going to take a vote right now, and who wants Scott to be the chairman of the board? 6 people raised their hand. I couldn't raise my hand, and so it passed. Who wants Scott to be president? 6 people raised their hand. And so Jim realized what was going on, and he put his coat over his shoulder, and he stood up and he said, gentlemen, it's indeed been an honor and a privilege playing with you. He quoted a line from Titanic, and he walked out, and Stan went, me too. And that was the last I ever saw of him, except for the day that I went to the funeral where Stan had died. And I saw Jim, and he didn't speak to me. And so that was the end of that relationship.
That's horrible.
That was not fun.
So you talk a lot in the book about the need for a trade association, and you talk about Pi Day. I think, and everybody knows Life of Pi is a big story. So from your point of view, what was Pi Day all about? And
I don't want to sound like Martin Luther King, but I had a dream. And it literally came to me in a dream. And I thought, the Academy Awards are happening, and that Life of Pi was going to win the Best Visual Effects Oscar. And Rhythm & Hughes, who did the work, was going out of business and bankrupt as a result. And I thought, what if we just got a ton of visual effects people on a picket line with signs saying, I want a piece of the pie? And so I had a conversation with a couple of people, and they said, yeah, let's do it. And they organized, I didn't organize it, they organized a group of several hundred people, and they went on the picket line, and the press didn't cover it. And when the visual effects supervisor from Rhythm & Hughes went to go get his award and gave a speech, they walked him off to the theme of Jaws. and they didn't even let him really talk, and they just walked him off. Which again shows you just how much Hollywood cares about the work that you do. Additionally, now in an international box office environment where 70% of all box office of major films is not US box office. So in an international box office environment where the common language is visual imagery, not actual dialogue, right? The visual effects component of a film is the most critical part of a film to put butts in the seats. So, you guys are the new stars. What the hell are you doing about it? Where are your agents? Where's your trade association? Why can't you, with all the imagination you have, imagine taking back the power that is yours? But you haven't been able to do it. And they've tried and tried again, but it keeps falling flat on its face. And so, that's really discouraging. And then the next thing, and you're not going to like me for saying this, but the next thing is the studios, the clients, now own several of the major facilities. So the concept of pulling 7 of the major facilities together to go against the studios, it's now 4, right? So that's a problem. And then the looming opportunities that are happening with artificial intelligence, that is another issue that needs to be addressed. So I really don't see a trade association happening. I've given it up, and I've gone through a lot of therapy, and I've given it up, and I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I'd be very concerned. I'm glad I'm 74.
So you kind of segued there into my next question, which is to bring us current to 2025 and give us your views, Scott Ross, on the future of artificial intelligence and how it's going to affect us.
I'm in the process of reading, I just read Harari, and I'm in the process of reading Mustafa Suleyman's book, The Next Wave. If you haven't read it, read it. And be afraid, be very afraid. It's very, very concerning. I think artificial intelligence will do incredible things in a lot of different, it's a paradox. There's wonderful things that will come as a result of it, and possibly horrible things that will come as a result of it. But as it affects the visual effects and animation industry, when I started working at ILM, there was about 125 people.
All of ILM, yeah,
All
150.
about 125 people. And there were only 3 or 4 companies, probably 3 major companies that were doing visual effects. That's in the mid-1980s. And now I think there's something like 1,700 visual effects companies and over 100,000 visual effects workers. And so the question becomes, as AI permeates the industry, and now remember, let's get back to the schmata business, they're always looking for a deal. They're always looking to get it for cheaper. And where does that expense come from? It comes from, 1,500 shots in a Marvel movie, right? And who's doing those 1,500 shots? Visual effects workers. So in terms of what the opportunity is, I'd start A, reading a lot about it, B, understanding how it works, C, really start to become expert in the field, and then D, look at all of the other opportunities that are going to be coming around that need visual imagery for lots of different reasons, whether it's the medical industry or, nowadays every product that you buy has a QR code and you scan it and you press it and they have a video, right? So I think there's going to be a lot of work, but you're not going to be John Lasseter. You're not going to be George Lucas. You're not going to do the work that a lot of us pioneers did back in the day. What I think will happen is that the entry-level people will start to go away because it will be replaced. And then when the entry-level people go away, who's going to fill the roles of the mid-level and senior people when the mid-level and senior people move up or out? So that's concerning. But I do think there are other opportunities that will show up, some of which we have no idea what they are, that will be able to utilize your skills and capabilities that might even give you the opportunity to have a 40-hour work week with benefits. Sounds nice, huh?
Yeah. So I want to leave a little bit of time for questions from the audience, because I know everybody here would love to talk to Scott. And I just got to say, Scott, I've known about you for a long time, and I've admired what you have tried to do on behalf of the artists for a long time. And I would kind of say that you're one of my heroes. And I'm wondering, who are some of your heroes?
You know, I've been in the movie industry for a really long time, and there are very few people that I've met that actually impress me. Marty Scorsese is one of them. He's one of the smartest guys I've ever met in my life. Robert Wise. And because I'm a musician, I'm much more interested in meeting musicians as opposed to directors and producers. Or animators even. And so I got to actually play on a record with Jimi Hendrix. I got to play cowbell on a song called Stone Free. More cowboy. I was the original guy. And you know, it's been the musicians that I've met in life that really are my heroes. Not necessarily because they're wonderful people. Miles was not a very nice guy, and Miles didn't like me. Because I was, you know, a long-haired white hippie. And at the time, he had issues, and rightfully so, right? But what a genius, you know? I really admire the genius of it all.
Well, I hope we get to hear your music sometime. That would be awesome. So I think now would be a good time to start opening it up to questions from the audience. So, yeah.
Hey, Scott. Hi, Scott.
You want to use the mic? Oh, sorry.
It's wireless, you can pass it around. We're pioneers, these are old people.
You speak in the book about one of your other passion projects, which was the film about the Hiroshima. Yeah. And Jim is now reportedly developing a project about the Hiroshima bombing.
I can't take it personally. Right? Because ultimately, Jim is a great filmmaker. And if he makes the film that I hope he makes, it'll serve the purpose of what I wanted to do, which was to stop nuclear weapons and stop nuclear warfare and show the horror of it. Which I do think Oppenheimer was a cop-out, and it didn't really show the effect. I got very, very close to my Japanese friends, and I wanted to do something that showed the situation of what happened on the ground in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. And interestingly enough, I brought the script to Jim. He read it. This is 25 years ago. He said to me, I also brought it to David Fincher. David said to me it was going to be too expensive. Jim said, yeah, I'm not sure. You know, I'm not. I said, well, it's sort of like Titanic. It's a love story taking place around, you know. And he said, yeah, not for me. So it sounds like he's doing something like that, but it's based on a book. It's not based on my screenplay. Hiroshima is, is history, and one can talk about it. And I just hope it's everything that I hope it could be.
Do you have the rights to Cranes?
I do. It didn't for a long time. When Digital Domain was sold, all of the assets of Digital Domain, which 1,000 Cranes was one of the assets, wound up in the hands of the guys that bought the company. And for years, I would go after this fellow and say, hey, I want it back, I'll buy it back. And after about 12 or 14 years, he finally came to me and said, it's yours, you just gotta give me $10. And so I have the rights again.
That's great.
Hi Scott, I'm Doug. I'm an AI researcher and a filmmaker. I have a lot of pressing questions about folklore and history. And because we're in Canada and I'm from Toronto, I'll even also ask about any stories about alias. But I'm not going to do that because I'm going to buy the book like everybody here and read about it. Instead, I'd like to ask your thoughts about managing R&D for visual effects and for visual generation. Because as we talked about, the film industry is all about the bottom line. It's all about keeping up with the release schedule for, July 4th release. But a lot of times R&D requires a longer view, takes time. Research, oftentimes you get into the wrong direction, you gotta change. And it conflicts with some of these business objectives. I'm wondering, how do you condone employees or researchers and manage that?
So, when I started Digital Domain, I tried to copy, to an extent, the ILM model and the things that work. And so one of the things we did is we separated our R&D software group into two groups. One was known as technical directors that solved problems in production, were writing plugins, etc. And producers and visual effects supervisors going, I can't figure this out, can you do this? And so there was a team of those people that were addressing those issues. And then there was the long-term software department. And these guys and gals would get together and put a plan for the coming year of the things that we as a company felt we needed to be able to develop. In fact, that's where Nuke came from, right? So managing those people is a whole different story. So the problem is, I have a good friend named Trip Hawkins who started Electronic Arts. And Trip used to always complain about the fact of building a video game was always difficult, especially because they had to reach their Christmas deadline. So we had deadlines that we weren't in control of. Trip and the folks at EA had deadlines that they were in control of. Now, if they missed Christmas, it was a screw up, but it wasn't like someone saying, I'm going to sue you if you don't deliver, Madden football by December 9th. At Digital Domain, for example, we had deadlines because movies were going to be released. And I think we only missed one deadline, and that was Titanic. And the reason we missed it was because I like to say that we were a bakery, and I had the water, and I had the flour, and I had the bakers, and I had the ovens, and they were set to 450 degrees, and we were ready to go, but Jim had the eggs. And unless he delivered the damn eggs, we couldn't make bread. And so we missed our date. And it wound up, interestingly enough, becoming to the advantage of 20th Century Fox, Paramount, and Jim Cameron, because he owned box office from his release date in November all the way to the next summer. Had he released in the summer on July 4th, we don't know what could have happened, because he was up against other big projects. So I would try to work, I knew what I didn't know. I'm not a software person, but I hired people. I inherited Doug Kay and George Joblove, and they knew what they were doing, and they also understood the fiscal responsibilities, and they managed those groups. And I hired people like Sebastian Silvan, and he had a similar kind of feeling and understanding as to how to be able to move the software department to finals and getting products delivered. And in fact, I would have to say, go even further, the reason why the company was as successful as it was had a lot to do with the people that worked for me and not as much for me. Because one of the things I did was, I thought that you get power by giving power away. The more power you give away to the right people, the better you look and the better the company looks. And so, I wasn't a master at certain things, I hired good masters.
And I think a testament to that having worked is that George and Doug and you are all here with us right now. So thank you for that. Okay, Mike.
Yeah, it was great working for you at
Thanks, Mike.
Digital Domain and the people there, and like you say, projects like Nuke were amazing. The first version was incredible. But the question I've got is, there's a lot more people that are being unionized now. Surprisingly, a lot of companies are getting into unionization, and there's also a lot of companies going out of business. So, what do you see? Is there hope for unionization for a lot of the CG workers happening?
So that's a great question. So let me preface it with, I marched in the streets with Cesar Chavez. Those of you who are old enough to remember Cesar Chavez. My father was a union steward at the Transport Workers Union back in New York. I am as lefty as you can possibly be, as if anybody watches my Facebook, they're going to come and arrest me. Absolutely. My days are done. There's going to be some ice guys going to be knocking on the door.
Yeah, they're outside waiting.
That's right.
Now we're in Canada.
That's right. That's right. But I think that because the visual effects industry is an international business now, so there are world-class companies in India, there are world-class companies in London, there are world-class companies throughout the globe. So unless there's a union that is really an international union and can sign up the majority of these companies, I think a union harms us. Because again, schmata business, they want the best deal. And if there is no labor laws in Hyderabad or Pune, and there's no union, and the work can be done in London, let's say, why would they go there? Unless they were union signatories as well. So unless there's an international union, not just like Canada and the US where it says IATSE, which is the International Association, international my butt, right? You need to be international. That's why I was always a proponent of a trade association. Because a trade association is not about price fixing, it's about changing the business model. And so that trade association, and by the way, everybody in the world basically the porn industry has a trade association. Coca-Cola and Pepsi are together in a trade association. General Motors, Chrysler, Honda, they're on a trade association. So I think that could solve it. I'm wondering if it's too late. I don't know.
Actually, my question is very similar to this, so if you can continue talking about this, is like, do you think there is still a shot at fixing the business model? And given all the things you said, do you think the leverage should come from the workers rather than the trade association nowadays?
You know, it would be great. It's like if you go back and you look at things like the animation union, the efforts came from the workers. And it's all about the workers, let's face it, right? The problem I've seen is that, well, there's the George Lucas line, which is if you give them enough pizza and beer, they'll do anything. And then there are these young people coming in, they're like, I'm so excited to be working on, I'm putting spider webs in spiders' hands. I have an eyebrow that's moving Woody in Toy Story. And so if people are willing to lie down on their bayonets and kill themselves, they'll never pull the workers together. The workers need to be together, and it needs to be international, and you need leaders to do that, and I haven't seen it.
That's what happened at ILM. It was a union shop the whole time I was there, and thank you to IATSE. My union pension is now paying our mortgage, which is great. But shortly after I left, they got rid of the union, and a lot of it was because management had convinced the employees that they didn't need a union, and it imploded because there was no longer the internal support from the employees to keep it going. So
I actually am probably the only CEO that I know of that ran a union shop, which is ILM, and a non-union shop, which was Digital Domain. And I'll tell you that one of the other problems is that the IA was generally thought of as blue-collar workers. And the men and women that worked in visual effects and animation had advanced degrees. And so it felt like it was their father's union and not their union. So that was another big issue.
yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Where is it coming from, the fixed cost type of contract? Because I think you said it, like everything else in film production is cost plus markup. So is it because of this kind
So
of deal?
if you go back in history, visual effects facilities were part of the studios, right? So Disney had Buena Vista Effects, right? So they were all part of the studios. And so when the studios were bidding internally, right, the studios just said, what's your bid, and stick to it. So that was how the model started. And then as the studios started to close down their visual effects facilities, the folks that were technical or creative started these new businesses, whether it was Richard Edlund at Boss or John Dykstra at Apogee. They were creative or technical people starting. They didn't have business capabilities. They didn't understand that. So they followed the model that was. And we haven't had the courage to change it.
I think we've got time for, well, we'll get Doug as well. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about culture. So I work at Digital Domain here in Vancouver, and we have a pirate flag, a lot of things coming from LA and so on. So it's still alive. My question is really about how this continues to future generations. Now we've had a lot of work, like I work in the office, but most of the people are work from home. And how has work from home really impacted, the culture and passing the torch to new people? What are your thoughts about that?
So I'm lucky enough to be old enough to never have worked at home. And none of the people that ever worked with me worked at home. So one of the great things about ILM and Digital Domain is we did everything. We did creatures, we did motion control, we did blue screen photography, we did compositing, we had an art department. We were all together as a unit, and that was really important for culture. And better ideas came out as a result of all of these great people. At Digital Domain, we had some really freaking brilliant people. And when they sat around the table, they were able to solve problems or come up with ideas that had never been come up with before. And if you're sitting in front of a terminal and you're at home and your kid's screaming and your husband's telling you to get off, I just don't see it. Call me OG and old-fashioned and whatnot, but it doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, one last question from the great Doug Hay.
Thanks. Scott, good to see you. It's more just a comment than a question. I really appreciate the honesty in your book, transparency, and the emotional vulnerability that you showed. And I encourage people to read it just for that, for being willing to share your doubts, your fears, and how you overcame them, because that's just applicable to any other business and any other life, and we all run through it. So thanks for being willing to go ahead and do that.
You're welcome.
At this point, with AI and the impact, it's really traumatic. It's your advice at the moment for everyone to learn everything you can and do everything you can and make yourself as high up as possible is a good one. But it's going to have an impact, and it's not just on our field, it's every field. And you hear, oh, it's just like when you guys at ILM and you went from optical to digital and such. The work expanded, and there was just more and more things to do. But that went from 150 shots to 2,000 shots in every movie, and there's more stuff. But right now, it just looks like it's going to be significant, and it's not just our field. Artists, we're the bellwether for it, but it's going to impact workforce worldwide. So it's just getting out there and using your pulpit as best as you can, I think, to just communicate. This has to be talked about at a higher level, and there have to be global solutions, not just, our little industry.
It really concerns me when I hear people say, and there's a term for it that I think Harari uses in his book, and because my mind is going, is that people look at things that happened in the past and they apply it to what could happen in the future. So when digital replaced analog, there were some changes, but we learned and people learned and things, and we got through it. Or that whole fear of robotics, and we got through it. This is different. This is not a tool. This is an agent. This is a different thing. And it's pervasive in a very big way. And again, it's a paradox. It will save millions of people's lives, and it will do incredible things. But it's the most impactful technology that I think we've seen since fire.
And on that, we're going to have to close this session now. But Scott will be at a meet and greet right outside the former city lobby. And he does have some things to sign. So everybody, please come and talk to Scott at the meet and greet. And thank you for attending today.